So hi everyone, so welcome to the online car showroom. For those of you that have not been to one of these before, I'm Hannah Baker and I'm one of the directors at Cambridge Architectural Research. CAR is an interdisciplinary company and we've got researchers in energy, buildings and cities, risk, and also have practicing engineers. Before the pandemic, we aim to have regular showrooms in the CAR offices, inviting speakers to present their work on different aspects of the built environment. But for the last year, we've moved these online and they've been very successful, and we already have another one planned for after the summer break. Also, in a few weeks' time, we are also starting an online webinar for early researchers and professionals to give them the opportunity to present their work through a panel discussion format. So after this event, you're likely to receive an email about that. But for today's showroom, Raf Orlowski is talking about acoustics in architectural design. CAR's chair, William Fawcett, will introduce him after I've briefly talked about the structure for today. So Raf will present for about 30 to 40 minutes and then we'll open up for discussion with some questions from you. You can either ask this by clicking on the button which says raise your hand and then coming into the panel, or you can type it in the question and answer box. The talk is being recorded, but this will stop when it comes to the questions. Helping with coordinating this is Natcha, a PhD student in the architecture department at Cambridge. So I'd like to thank her, and also Janet Owers for the time she spends liaising with the speakers and sending out the invites. My last thanks is to Raf for agreeing to speak today, and now I will pass over to William to introduce him. William, you need to unmute.
Simple, really. Welcome to everybody in the audience who I can't see, of course, and particularly welcome to Raf. Raf is an old friend of CAR. He's actually given a previous car showroom in November 2010, in the old days before it was online. But our sort of shared origins go back quite a lot further to the late 1980s in the Martin Centre. Raf was joined the Acoustics research group at the Martin Centre, working with Mike Barron on a very ambitious project on auditorium acoustics. And it's just at that time that a group of people in the Martin Centre, including Mike Barron, set up CAR. CAR dates back to 1987. Raf stayed 10 years at the Martin Centre working on acoustics, and then took a lectureship at Salford University. At that point, he sort of slightly changed direction, and his sort of purely academic career changed direction. He came back to Cambridge and worked with the team setting up Arup Acoustics consultancy, and this sort of moved from an academic world into a consultancy world with strong research and academic connections. It's sort of very parallel to CAR's. That's the role we see for ourselves, and it's also a role that Raf has adopted. He was at Arup Acoustics for 20 years and then moved to Ramboll and set up the acoustics team in Ramboll, also in Cambridge, where he continues as a very leading acoustics consultant. But at the same time, he's maintained academic contacts. He's been a visiting professor at the University of Sheffield, currently a visiting professor at the Bartlett School of Architecture. And in 2019, he was awarded the R.W.B. Stevens Medal of the Institute of Acoustics. It's an award given every 2 years for outstanding contributions to acoustics research and teaching. So we're very fortunate to have such a distinguished speaker today, and look forward to your presentation. Raf, welcome.
Thank you very much, William, for a very kind introduction and for inviting me to give this talk on acoustics in architectural design. It's based on a book I've written, which will be available in the bookshops either at the end of May or the beginning of June. The book's intended for students of architecture and acoustics and those with a general interest in the subject. It starts with a historical description of the evolution of auditorium design from the Greek theatre up to the 21st century. There are also sections on schools, worship spaces, the law courts, transportation buildings and offices, but I don't think I'm going to have time to talk about those today. So starting with the Greek theatre, one of the best examples is the theatre at Epidauros, which is still in use today. It was built around 300 BC and has a huge audience capacity of 14,000, 3 times the size of the Royal Albert Hall. It's developed a reputation for having wonderful acoustics, and indeed it does have good acoustics for speech. And there are 3 reasons for this. First of all, the theatre was built in a very quiet area, so it has a very quiet background, so no noise interfering with the spoken word. It's also got a very steep seating rake, over 26 degrees, which gives a clear, unobstructed path between the speaker and the listener. And the third reason is that the speaker is standing on a very hard stone stage, which reflects some of the speech sounds, which reinforce the direct sound and adds to the loudness and clarity. We call these early reflections. It gives a useful early reflection. Now, there is one minor acoustical problem with Epidauros, and it is that the seats at the sides have weaker sound because of the directionality of the human voice. The human voice tends to be most of the important parts of the speech in a forwards direction, so the side seats don't get so much of that sound energy. And the Greeks were well aware of this, and they reserved these seats at the sides for latecomers, foreigners, and pregnant women. Now, the Romans followed on from the Greeks, adopting the same sort of plan shapes, and their designs are well documented in such publications as Vitruvius's 10 Books of Architecture. And when it came to the Renaissance period and there was a flourishing of new buildings for the performing arts, the architects at that time, Palladio and so on, followed in the footsteps of the Greeks and Romans and adopted these sorts of plan shapes. And one of the examples of an early opera house is the Teatro Farnese in Parma, which was built in 1610, and it is in the form of an amphitheatre, but it has somewhat elongated sides forming a U-type plan shape. And this central area was regularly used as an extension of the stage, and sometimes spectacular enactments were made, such as mock sea battles. Now, one of the important things the architect introduced into this design is a major new element, which is the proscenium arch, which you can see in the top left-hand corner of the picture. And this feature effectively separates the real world from theatrical fiction. Of course, it's a feature we still have in theatres today. Now, this plan shape developed into the classical horseshoe-shaped Italian Baroque opera house. This is an early example in Venice, the Teatro San Giovanni San Paulo, and it shows the traditional U-shaped floor, and this was surrounded by tiers of boxes. So the people in Venice were very keen on attending opera at that time, and were willing to pay money to go and visit the opera. And so the organizers wanted to pack in as many seats as possible. So they put these people in these tiers of boxes and also put them on in the stores in the U-shaped floor. Now, the most famous architects of opera houses in this period were the Galli Bibbiena family, who dominated opera house design for over a century, starting in 1700. One of their outstanding designs is the Margrafischen Opernhaus in Bayreuth, which opened in 1747. This auditorium is an intimate space seating 520. It's got very heavy ornamentation, as you can see here, which has the acoustical advantage of scattering the sound evenly over the seating area, and it minimizes any focusing caused by the concave horseshoe plan. Now, a contemporary author of these architects made the following observations about their opera house designs. He agreed that timber linings should be used internally to equalize the sound. And that's a very perceptive comment, because these buildings were built of masonry to avoid fire, which would have created a very long reverberation time at base frequencies, which is poor for the spoken word. And so lining them with thin timber linings tended to reduce the strength of the bass and form a more equalized sound. He also made comments like that flat walls make the voice sound too sharp, while a room with tapestries made the voice too silent. So he recommended that these opera houses should be lined with timber to make the voice loud and pleasant. What's interesting about these 18th century writings is that they showed a remarkably good understanding of acoustic design. Now, in acoustical terms, the horseshoe plan form has the potential for providing good acoustics. And the main volume, if it's sufficiently large, produces ample reverberation for opera. And the balcony fronts provide these early reflections that we talked about, which can enhance clarity and intimacy. However, these acoustical attributes are only perceived by the audience in the stalls and those in the front rows of the boxes. Those people seated further back in the boxes experience an increasingly remote sound the further back they are. So boxes are not particularly good in acoustical design terms. As opera going in Italy became more popular, the size of opera houses increased. This is the Teatro alla Scala in Milan, opened in 1778. It's a very large house compared with the earlier ones, seats 2,800 people with 7 tiers of boxes. But the plan form does follow the classic horseshoe. In acoustical terms, La Scala is considered as one of the world's leading opera houses, but its acoustic characteristics are similar to the other Baroque opera houses in that the acoustics are best on the main floor and at the front of the boxes, and those listeners further back in the boxes receive a poorer sound. Now, there is an exception to opera houses based on the horseshoe plan form, and one of the early exceptions is the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth. And this design evolved from the radical thinking of the opera composer Richard Wagner. Wagner disliked the social stratification and poor sight lines of Baroque theatres and developed a wedge-shaped auditorium with a single tier of steeply raked seating, which provided an egalitarian arrangement with good sight lines for 1800. The acoustics turned out to be appropriate for Wagner's operas, a long reverberation time of about 1.5 seconds. Typically for opera, it should be about 1.25 or even less. And a muted orchestral sound, because Wagner designed a very large orchestra pit, which was covered over with a hood on the audience side so that the orchestra sound was muted. And this was a desirable effect that Wagner wanted, and it also increased the balance between the singers and the orchestra in favor of the singers, which is often a problem in opera house design. Now, if you just have a glimpse at what's happened to opera houses in the 21st century, this is an opera house that was built near Guildford in Surrey, opened very recently in 2017. And the client insisted that the plan shape of the opera house should be the traditional horseshoe, In fact, it should follow the form of La Scala Milan, only a much smaller scale. This is 700 seats. And when it opened in 2017 for the first season, it received very high praise in the press for the acoustic quality. So it seems that following the traditional horseshoe plan shape is a recipe for successful acoustics. Now, one exception to this is a new opera house in China at Guangzhou, built in 2010, and the architects were Zaha Hadid, and she actually, her original concept for an opera house was based on the opera house she designed for Cardiff Bay Opera House, which was never built, of course. And this opera house in Guangzhou is also asymmetric. It's got these sweeping curves, which have been carefully adjusted for acoustic reflections. And it has been well received when it originally opened, and it remains to be seen whether this departure from the traditional form of opera houses is a one-off or whether it actually will prevail. Now, moving on to concert halls now. So by contrast with opera houses, concert halls evolved from the acoustically intimate rooms of the 18th century, such as this one, the Haydnsaal, where Haydn himself was the Kapellmeister. The Haydnsaal is a rectangular space with a narrow width, a high ceiling, seats 400, and the reverberation time, excuse me, is highly suited for classical music. It's about 1.7 seconds, and it has a strong bass response. So this long reverberation, coupled with strong reflections from the narrow sidewalls, has the ingredients of producing an intense, enveloping sound. Now, most of the people that attended these concerts at places like the Haydnsaal were the aristocracy, but these concerts got more popular, and so the general public wanted to attend these concerts, and so they built larger concert halls. And this is the 19th century Musikvereinssal in Vienna, built in 1872, and it's still regarded as one of the world's best concert halls for classic and romantic music. The music played in this hall is heard with a high degree of clarity, together with a fullness of tone, and together with ample loudness. There's also a feeling of being intimately involved with the musical performance and being enveloped by the sound, a kind of surround sound effect. And the characteristic architectural features are a narrow width, 20 meters wide, a high ceiling, 18 meters, and intricate surface ornamentation. And this form of concert hall, of course, has become known as the shoebox-shaped concert hall. And the design of the Musikvereinssal, which was carried out over 150 years ago, did not involve special acoustical advice. There was no acoustic consultants involved. Its acoustical success is due partly to architectural empiricism and to a certain extent some good fortune. Now, at the same time as the Musikvereinssal was built, a very large hall was built in London with 5,000 seats, namely the Royal Albert Hall. And the Royal Albert Hall developed a reputation soon after it opened for having a serious acoustical fault, namely an echo from the domed ceiling. Not only did the echo from the ceiling suffer a long delay, about a quarter of a second delay, but it was focused by the dome, and that which made the echo rather loud. So at that time, a saying developed among concert goers that you could have 2 concerts for the price of 1 ticket. It wasn't until 1968 that the echo problem was invested thoroughly, using, as you can see in this picture, gunshots, a bassoon, and a highly directional microphone. Then the investigation resulted in the suspension of 135 convex saucers, which are sometimes referred to as mushrooms, beneath the dome. And these mushrooms prevent the incident sound from reaching the dome. They're scattered by the mushroom before they reach the dome, and therefore they reduce the echo. During the refurbishment of the Royal Albert Hall in 2001, there were various schemes for getting rid of the rest of the echo, but the one that was actually chosen was retaining the mushrooms, but they are rearranged into what's sometimes called the condensed mushroom configuration. Now, a major step in acoustics occurred at the turn of the 20th century when Professor Wallace Clement Sabine proposed his theory of reverberation. Sabine's theory helped to dispel much confusion in acoustics, which still existed even at the beginning of the 20th century. Such confusion is illustrated by an essay written by an eminent Viennese architect, Adolf Loos. Loos wrote a paper in 1912 entitled Das Mysterium der Akustik, in which he proposed that concert halls become acoustically excellent when fine music is played in them and is gradually absorbed by the walls. In the mortar, he said, live the sounds of great composers. The music of our symphony orchestras and the voices of singers impregnate the building materials, causing mysterious changes in the molecular structure, as in the wood of old violins. But brass instruments, he warned, had a bad effect, and military music in a fine hall could ruin its acoustics within a week. And for the same reason, opera houses have poor acoustics on the side where the brass players sit. By contrast with Adolf Loos' Mysteries of Acoustics, written in 1912, Sabine pursued an objective approach based on the concept of reverberation time. Reverberation time, loosely defined, is the time in seconds it takes for a loud sound when it's stopped to decay to inaudibility. So for concert halls, it should be 2 seconds, and for theatres, around 1 second. Now, Boston Symphony Hall was the first concert hall to benefit from Sabine's advice. In deciding what the acoustic quality and reverberation time should be, Sabine referred to a famous concert hall in Leipzig, the Neues Gewandhaus. The seating capacity of the Neues Gewandhaus was 1,560, and Sabine needed to increase it by 70% to 2,600. He made it clear that the design was not simply a matter of proportionately increasing the dimensions, and he therefore carried out careful calculations according to his theory to define the length, width, and height. The hall, it is a classic shoebox, has come to be regarded as one of the 3 best concert halls in the world. The eminent acoustician, American acoustician Beranek, describes the sound as clear, live, warm, brilliant, and loud without being overly loud. Now, Sabine's work was unfortunately not widely adopted in the first part of the 20th century, and a lot of halls built during this period were fan-shaped halls with short reverberation times, following to a certain extent the design of the new cinemas. But a new era in concert hall design started after the Second World War, heralded in the UK by the Royal Festival Hall. Now, in designing the Royal Festival Hall, a good design decision was the choice of a rectangular plan shape rather than the popular at that time fan shape. The acoustician Hope Bagnall felt that the cross reflections, which occur in the traditionally shaped shoebox halls, are important for acoustic quality, particularly the fullness of tone. But a less good decision in the design was to have a very large seating capacity of 3,000. It's still one of the largest concert halls in Europe. The original aspiration for the reverberation time was 2.2 seconds, ideal for orchestral music. On completion of the hall, the measured reverberation time was only 1.5 seconds, substantially short, with the result that the hall gained a reputation for high clarity of sound, but lack of fullness of tone. There's some reasons for this shortfall. One was that the ceiling construction was considerably lighter than specified, and therefore vibrating with bass frequencies and absorbing bass sound. Another problem was the absorption of the seating was underestimated. And to remedy this shortfall in reverberation time, an electronic enhancement system was installed called Assisted Resonance. And this raised the reverberation time, particularly in the bass. So here we've got a graph of the reverberation time on the vertical axis versus frequency on the horizontal axis. The dashed line shows the reverberation time in the natural state, and the solid line with the electronic system switched on. The performers and listeners noted a more reverberant and warmer sound with the electronic system, and there were few objections to the introduction of electronics. The system was successfully operated for over 30 years, but eventually it proved difficult to maintain, and it was switched off in 1998. There were then attempts to increase the reverberation time by passive means, which were only partially successful. And the reputation for high clarity and low reverberance has unfortunately remained. Although the design completed in the early 50s embodied all the knowledge that was then available on concert hall design, the challenges of providing good acoustics for such a large audience were perhaps not fully appreciated, and the errors in the ceiling construction and the seating absorption were unfortunate. Now, around the same time as the design and building of the Royal Festival Hall, there was something going in New York. So in the mid-50s, the New York Philharmonic Orchestra appointed the eminent American acoustician Leo Beranek to design a new concert hall. Beranek decided that the key requirement in a concert hall is acoustic intimacy, which can be attained by reflecting surfaces close to the audience, which provide these early reflections with a very short time delay within 20 milliseconds of the direct sound. Beranek's design for the hall was a shoebox, which is shown in the lower plan shape in this slide. But it was strongly criticized by the client for not accommodating the required number of generously sized seats, 2,750. And the architect came under severe pressure because of this, and he proposed new plans which involve bulging out the side walls of the shoebox, as you can see in the upper plan, to accommodate 250 more seats. In an attempt to make these changes work acoustically, Beranek added ceiling reflectors over most of the audience. So as you can see there, the reflectors cover almost the whole ceiling. Soon after the opening concert in 1962, criticisms of the acoustics appeared in the press, such as the Philharmonic Hall will never have the mellowness of the great ones of the past. The sound at best is going to be on the dry side, with clarity the primary consideration. The board replaced Beranek with another acoustician, Cyril Harris, who worked with the new architect with a brief to gut the hall whilst leaving the building's original shell and build a new concert hall in its place. What's remarkable about Harris's design, it's that it's very similar to Beranek's original design, of a shoebox shape, but without ceiling reflectors. This is what the hall looks like today, looking towards the stage. The newly named Avery Fisher Hall opened in 1976, and the response was initially complimentary. But in time, the acoustics of the hall were still not considered to be good enough, and in 2004, the orchestra announced that improvements to the hall's acoustics would be made, but these plans were scrapped in 2017, so the hall remains as it is. The ongoing history of the Philharmonic Hall is one of the biggest and costliest acoustic disasters in the last 70 years. Beranek claims that contributors to this disaster were lack of time, money, and communication. The rumors and superstitions about the acoustics generated by the press were also particularly unhelpful. There's also a balance to be struck between acoustical design, architecture, the client's aspirations, the critics, and the response of the public. With such a high-profile building in such a high-profile location, getting all these factors to align is challenging. And that's, I think, my takeaway point from this talk today, is that in designing these spaces, there does have to be a balance between acoustical design, architecture, clients' aspirations, and so on. Now we come to a rather more successful hall. This is the Berlin Philharmonie. It was built a few years after the completion of the Royal Festival Hall. It has 2,400 seats, and the architect was Hans Scharoun, and his vision was revolutionary, namely to place the orchestra and conductor in the center of the auditorium and surround them with audience. His concept of the space was that of a valley with the orchestra at the bottom, surrounded by slopes of vineyard terraces. He also intended that the distribution of the audience should be as egalitarian as possible, and split the terraces up into blocks, each containing between 100 and 300 seats. The blocks have surrounding walls, which has the advantage of introducing many sound reflecting surfaces in amongst the body of the audience. Scharoun was fortunate in having a first-class acoustician working with him, Professor Lothar Kramer, who was somewhat skeptical about the acoustical success of an auditorium in the round. However, Scharoun offered to accommodate Kramer's advice in every possible way if he was allowed to retain his original concept of a surround hall. Although Scharoun may have wanted a completely in the round arrangement with equal seating on all sides, this was not considered feasible with the traditional layout of an orchestra, and so there's a frontal bias to the seating distribution, with only 10% of the seats behind the orchestra. This suits a majority of listeners who prefer to sit in front of the orchestra to be able to hear the correct balance. Other people prefer to be closer to the performers and watch the conductor and so on. The acoustics of Berlin Philharmonie have developed a very high reputation, which has been maintained over many years. The sound is considered to have high clarity with ample reverberance. What is remarkable about the design is that it has spawned many similar designs which have become known as the Vineyard Terrace Halls, and their popularity has continued into the 21st century, and we'll look at how that has fared in a few moments. Not long after the Berlin Philharmonie, researchers began to investigate other factors besides reverberation time to account for variations in acoustic quality between the different seats. It emerged that reflections arriving at the listener within 1/10 of a second of the direct sound, 80 milliseconds in fact, increased the clarity of the sound. This implied that clarity and its balance with reverberance can be controlled by the number of and strength of the early reflections, and these of course can be controlled by the geometry of the space itself. In the late 1960s, the acoustician Harold Marshall proposed that the direction of early reflections is important, and those which arrive at a listener from a lateral direction give an increased sense of spaciousness, or surround sound, if you like, to when listening to orchestral music. His hypothesis was confirmed by the experimentation of somebody we know very well, Michael Barron, who, as William said, was one of the founding members of Carr and worked in Cambridge for a period of 15 or so years. In detail, this effect of receiving lateral early reflections is perceived as a broadening of the sound source, which can extend to completely envelop the listener in musical sound, surround sound effect. Now, this highly significant acoustical development was first applied by Harold Marshall in the design of a new concert hall in New Zealand, which is the Christchurch Town Hall, which was completed in 1972. The plan shape of this hall is a faceted ellipse with a balcony cantilevered from each of the facets. The capacity of the hall is 2,500, and owing to the elliptical shape, no seat is further than 28 meters from the stage front. The fundamental aim of the acoustical design was to direct ample early lateral reflections to the seating in support of Marshall's theory that such reflections give this sense of spaciousness. Marshall was not particularly concerned with the overall shape of this hall, but with surfaces within the hall that direct the sound towards the audience. He called this type of hall the directed reflection sequence hall. One of the most striking features of the hall is the large array of acoustic reflectors, which you can see here, with some additional ones above the stage. Each of these reflectors provides lateral reflections into the adjacent balcony seating area and into the stalls. Now, elliptical plan shape carries the risk of focusing, but this is largely avoided by the shadowing caused by these very large reflectors. The volume of the hall is very large, creates a long reverberation time of over 2 seconds when occupied, but subjectively the outstanding feature is the high degree of clarity in sound, which is balanced by a long reverberation. So what Marshall has achieved here is high level of clarity, but also long reverberation. Now, we move on to the 21st century, and an interesting development in the design of a new concert hall in Paris, the Paris Philharmonie. The appointed architect for this new concert hall was the Frenchman Jean Nouvel, and the appointed acoustician was Harold Marshall, the one we've just been talking about. However, Jean Nouvel had previously worked with another acoustician, the Japanese Yasuhisa Toyota, and controversially invited him to join the design team as a special advisor. So we have 2 acousticians working on one project. So there could be trouble ahead. The acoustic brief specified a hall with 2,400 seats with acoustic quality comparable to the best recent halls and with an innovative architectural concept. It also specified a central stage for classical music concerts, which steered the design towards a surround type hall. This sketch is a sketch made by the acoustic consultant Harold Marshall in a discussion with the architect Jean Nouvel. Marshall recognized the similarity between the brief and his design of the Christchurch Town Hall, which we've just talked about. The key parallels were a new typology, surrounding seat layout, independent control of the early sound of the orchestra and the later sound of the room, and to provide clarity together with reverberance. This led Marshall to consider a room within a room as a possible solution. He referred to this arrangement as the bicameral arrangement, 2 cameras, bicameral. The winning design proposed 2 nested chambers. The inner space, which is shown in red here, controls the early sound. So you can see the red arrow provides an early reflection from one of the walls of the inner space. And the outer space controls the response of the room, where the inner space and the outer space are connected by openings, and then the sound, once it enters the outer space, eventually comes back into the inner space as reverberation. So certainly a new concept. The implementation of the design had numerous challenges, as the project was heavily politicized, and having 2 acousticians on the design team with other acousticians in the wings created some tensions, as you might expect. However, the building was successfully completed, and here it is. And in terms of the Paris, the Philharmonie-de Paris meeting the acoustic brief, it certainly introduced a new topology, the bicameral hall, and the key subjective attributes such as clarity, reverberance, and loudness seem to have all been achieved. It has been criticized, particularly for those seats that are behind the orchestra and to the sides of the orchestra, and they are less favored in terms of sound quality. And this seems to be a problem that's emerging with these surround type halls. The last hall I'm going to talk about is a very recent one. It's the Philharmonie in Hamburg, and the architects were Herzog and de Meuron's 2,100 seat concert hall. It's opened in 2017. The acoustic consultant here was the Japanese Yasuhisa Toyota, who we just talked about from the Paris project. The client had already decided on a surround type hall, and the subsequent design approach was to provide intimacy by placing the audience as close as possible to the performers, following the idea of the concept of the Berlin Philharmonie. And to achieve acoustical intimacy, the seating was split up into groups, as in the Berlin hall, each surrounded by low walls which created early reflections. 15-meter wide saucer-shaped canopy was suspended above the stage, providing reflections for musicians. A particularly notable feature of the design is the irregular surface texture over the complete walls and ceiling, named the white skin. This has a seashell motif and provides high-frequency diffusion and the suppression of possible disturbing echoes. Following the inaugural concert, the hall proved very popular with audiences who were attracted not only by the music, but by the architectural splendor of the building, whose viewing plaza provides spectacular vistas over the Elbe River and the city of Hamburg. However, disquiet about the acoustics began to emerge, which was voiced initially by the conductors. Peter Ruzicka was quoted as saying, "The side blocks suffer from a strongly shifted acoustic balance." Whilst Marek Janowski said, "I think I can say in all modesty that the Elbe Philharmonie does not belong to the best concert halls in the world." The eminent recording engineer Cord Garben considered that the white skin of the hall is a sound killer. The criticisms came to a head when the renowned tenor Jonas Kaufmann was heckled by the audience members, who shouted that they could not hear him, and some walked out. In response, Kaufmann vowed that he may not sing in the hall ever again. It's likely that the most vociferous audience members who could not hear at Kaufmann's concert were sitting behind the singer, or maybe to the side. This is another example of the shortcoming of these surround type halls, which have a significant proportion of seats behind the stage, as you can see in the slide. In summary, the Philharmonie has not met expectations acoustically and has thrown some doubt on the acoustic potential of surround type halls, in particular the sound in the seats behind the stage. So where do we go from here? Are surround halls falling out of favour? Are we going to revert to the shoebox, or are we going to adopt new topologies? Perhaps the coronavirus pandemic will force a new topology where the audience is subdivided into boxes and we go back to the design of the traditional opera houses. Just to finish off, I'd like to briefly think about future possibilities. So with the onset of the coronavirus in early 2020 and the subsequent lockdowns of opera houses, concert halls, theatres throughout the world, the impact of these events on future designs remains uncertain. It may lead to new and innovative architectural concepts, although the acoustic criteria will not be able to change. An example of an extreme architectural solution for maintaining social distancing was developed for the Victorian prison chapel at Lincoln Castle, where screens were placed between inmates so they could not see each other, but each could see and hear the central preacher. The social distancing in that case was not, of course, for health reasons. So although this is an extreme example, it demonstrates that effective architectural solutions are possible, and we shall see how the architecture develops. Thank you very much.